The night Eliza boarded the westbound train, the air was thick with rain and the smell of coal smoke. She clutched her carpet bag with both hands, the worn leather handle digging into her palms, but she didn't loosen her grip. It was all she owned now. Her last few dresses, a shawl, and the crumpled savings she had been tucking away for months. She didn't look back. Couldn't. Every part of her trembled as she stepped up into the dimly lit carriage. Her shoes were damp, her skirts muddy from the hurried walk through town. The station platform behind her was crowded with late-night travelers, but Eliza felt exposed, as though someone might still drag her back to the life she had just fled. She slid into a seat near the back, keeping her head low beneath the brim of her bonnet. The steady rumble of the train as it lurched forward offered a strange kind of comfort, a promise that every mile carried her further from the shouting, the slammed doors, the bruising words and cruel silences she had endured for so long. But with the relief came fear. She had never been this far from home. She had no one waiting at the other end. No job, no family to take her in. Only the whisper of a dream had pushed her forward. The thought that somewhere out west, life might be different, kinder. That there might be a place where she wasn't. Afraid to breathe too loudly. The train rocked steadily through the darkness, the windows reflecting her pale, anxious face. She tried to picture what lay ahead. Dusty little towns she'd only read about in letters, big skies stretching endlessly overhead, maybe even a chance to start over where no one knew her name. But doubt clawed at her. What if she had made a terrible mistake? What if the world beyond was harsher than the one she'd left behind? The train whistle blew, long and mournful, as the rain turned the glass to a blur of silver streaks. Eliza wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, willing her racing heart to settle. She reminded herself of the envelope in her bag. Her savings, meager though it was. Enough, perhaps, to pay for a room for a few nights. Enough to give her time to figure out what came next. She wasn't sure where courage ended and desperation began, but she clung to both with trembling hands. Because anything was better than going back. As the train rattled westward, the city lights faded behind her, swallowed by the night. Eliza sat straight-backed, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window, as though if she stared hard enough, she might glimpse the life she was chasing. A life she still barely dared to believe she deserved. The train screeched as it slowed into the little frontier town, sending up a cloud of steam and grit. Eliza pressed her forehead to the window, her stomach knotting as the unfamiliar landscape came into view. A single wooden platform stretched alongside the track, flanked by a small depot, a water tower, and a handful of hitching posts where a few horses waited patiently. Her heart thudded against her ribs. She had rehearsed this moment in her head for days, telling herself that stepping off the train would be her first step toward freedom. But as the conductor called for passengers to disembark, the sharp stab of fear returned. She stepped down onto the platform, clutching her carpet bag, so tightly that her knuckles ached. The air smelled of dust and wood smoke, with a faint sweetness drifting in from the prairie beyond. People bustled around her, men unloading freight, women greeting loved ones, children darting between legs, but no one looked her way. She turned in a slow circle, scanning every face, every wagon, every doorway. No one. The letter she'd carried for weeks had been vague, little more than a promise of opportunity from a man who claimed to have work for a respectable young lady willing to make a fresh start. It had been foolish, maybe, but it was the only thread of hope she'd had. Now, standing in the middle of the busy platform with no familiar face to claim her, that fragile hope unraveled. The crowd thinned as wagons creaked away and travelers disappeared into the town's handful of buildings. Soon, the platform was nearly empty. The rhythmic thud of the depot clock marking the passing minutes, Eliza sat stiffly on a bench near the edge of the platform, her carpetbag tucked against her knees, and tried to swallow the rising panic. She could feel the curious glances of a few townsfolk who lingered nearby. Two women whispered as they passed, their eyes sliding over her damp hem and pale face, but they didn't stop Dot. Maybe he had been delayed, she told herself. Maybe he'd come tomorrow. But the words felt hollow. Even in her own mind, her stomach twisted with hunger. She'd spent her last coins on the ticket and had nothing left for food. Worse, night was coming, and the thought of being alone in this strange town after dark made her chest tighten with dread. The depot agent gave her a polite but distracted nod as he locked up for the evening. "Safe night to you, miss," he murmured before disappearing down the street. By the time the last wagon rattled away and the platform lay in shadow, Eliza sat frozen, her breath shallow, her mind numb. She had fled everything familiar to find safety, and now here she was, utterly alone, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The tears came hot and fast, blurring her vision, but she blinked them back, refusing to cry where anyone could see. She wrapped her arms around her carpetbag, held herself still, and whispered into the quiet. "What now?" The last of the daylight faded to a deep, dusty rose as Eliza sat on the empty platform, her carpetbag hugged tight to her chest. The station lanterns flickered to life one by one, throwing long shadows across the wooden boards. She told herself to stand, to find somewhere, anywhere to go, but her legs felt like stone. A deep, steady voice broke through the quiet. "Miss, you lost?" Eliza startled, her head snapping up. A tall man stood a few paces away, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the lantern glow. He wore a work-worn hat, low over his brow, a flannel shirt rolled to his elbows, and boots coated with dust from the range. A coil of rope hung from one hand, and a quiet confidence seemed to roll off him like heat from a summer road. Behind his leg peeked a little girl, no more than 6 or 7, her brown curls framing a curious, round face. Eliza's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but only managed a shake of her head. The man tipped his hat slightly. "Name's Caleb Turner," he said, his voice calm but kind. "I was just picking up supplies. Couldn't help but notice you've been sitting here a while. Someone's supposed to meet you." Eliza hesitated, torn between pride and desperation. "I thought so," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But no one came. Caleb's gaze flicked to her carpetbag, then back to her pale, tired face. He crouched slightly, his tone gentle but steady, the way one might speak to a frightened colt. "Town will be shuttering down soon. Ain't safe to be out here alone after dark. You got a place to stay?" Her heart thudded painfully. She shook her head. "No, sir, She swallowed hard. "I don't." The little girl peeked out from behind her father's leg then, her eyes wide and solemn. "Papa," she said softly, tugging at his sleeve. "She looks cold." Caleb studied Eliza for a long moment, then unrolled the blanket draped over his arm and held it out to her. "Here," he said simply. "Ain't much, but it'll keep the chill off." Eliza hesitated, pride warring with gratitude. But when the evening wind cut sharp through her thin shawl, she finally reached out with trembling hands. The blanket was rough but warm, and she clutched it tightly around her shoulders, blinking back tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. Caleb tipped his hat again. "Ain't no trouble," he said, straightening to his full height. "Come morning, we'll figure something out. Maybe there's work or a place you can stay for a bit." For the first time since stepping off the train, Eliza felt a sliver of safety slip past her fear. a quiet promise in the steady calm of the cowboy's voice, And when the little girl offered her a shy, gap-toothed smile, whispering, "Don't be scared. Papa always helps," Eliza felt the first fragile thread of hope begin to weave through her heart, The wagon creaked steadily along the dirt road, its wheels crunching over the gravel as the town faded behind them. Eliza sat stiffly on the wooden bench, clutching her carpetbag in her lap, her knuckles white against the handle. She'd hesitated before accepting Caleb Turner's offer, every instinct screaming at her not to trust a stranger, but when the depot lights dimmed and the cool night wind bit through her shawl, the choice had been simple. Stay there, alone and vulnerable, or take a cautious chance. The little girl, Sadie, sat beside her, swinging her legs and humming softly to herself. Every now and then she'd glance up at Eliza with curious eyes, as if trying to solve a quiet mystery. Caleb drove in silence, his hat brim low over his brow, his profile etched sharp in the silver glow of the moonlight. Though he said little, his presence wasn't threatening. Instead, there was something steady about him, something that made Eliza's racing heart begin to slow. After nearly an hour, the wagon rolled through a gate and up a long, sloping lane lined with cottonwoods. The ranch appeared out of the darkness, a sturdy house with a wide porch, a barn off to the side, and fields stretching out toward the horizon. The place smelled of hay, wood smoke, and earth, a scent that tugged at something deep in Eliza, something that felt like home, even though she had never known such a place. Caleb hopped down first, looping the reins over the hitching post before turning to offer his hand. Eliza hesitated, then placed her gloved fingers in his calloused palm. The warmth of his grip startled her, not because it frightened her, but because it didn't. Inside, the house was simple, but welcoming. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and fresh bread, and a worn quilt lay draped over the back of a chair. Near the hearth, Sadie darted past them, her giggles echoing up the stairs as she fetched something from her room. "You can have the spare room," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. "It ain't much, but it's clean. You'll be safe here, till you figure out what comes next. Safe." The word lodged in her chest, sharp and unexpected. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Later, when the house was quiet and Sadie tucked into bed, Eliza sat alone in the little room Caleb had shown her. The space was modest, a narrow bed with a handmade quilt, a washstand, and a small dresser, but to her it felt like a refuge. She pressed a hand against her lips to keep the tears at bay, overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel hunted, didn't feel trapped. For the first time, she felt safe. And as she drifted into sleep, the faint murmur of Caleb's voice downstairs carried up through the floorboards, a quiet, grounding reminder that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place to rest, even if only for a while. Morning came early at the Turner Ranch. Eliza woke to the soft crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee drifting up the narrow stairs. For a moment, disoriented, she blinked at the wooden beams above her and the faded quilt covering her legs. Then memory returned, the quiet wagon ride, Sadie's gentle chatter, the way Caleb had said, "You'll be safe here." She dressed quickly, tucking her hair into a neat bun, and stepped downstairs. In the kitchen, Caleb stood at the stove, frying eggs in a well-worn cast-iron skillet. Sadie sat at the table with her doll, humming as she set out mismatched tin. "Plates." "Morning," Caleb said without looking up. His voice was low even, but not unkind. "Good morning," Eliza replied, hesitating near the doorway, unsure if she was intruding. Sadie beamed. "Papa says you can help me feed the chickens after breakfast," she announced, as if this were the most exciting news in the world. Eliza blinked, then managed a small smile. "I'd like that," she said softly. The day was a blur of quiet. tasks, and careful observations. Sadie took her hand as they crossed the yard, chattering about the hens, the barn cat, and a mare named Clover who was expecting a foal any day now. Eliza followed, uncertain at first, but there was something about the child's simple, sunny nature that loosened the tight knot of fear in her chest. Dot back in the house, she offered to wash the breakfast dishes and later mended a torn shirt she found draped over a chair. Caleb said little, but his eyes softened slightly when he found the shirt neatly folded on the table. By afternoon, her skirts were dusty, her hair loose from the wind, and her hands sore. But for the first time in months, she felt useful. Needed. That evening, the three of them sat around the small kitchen table for supper. The silence wasn't awkward, it was peaceful. Sadie recounted every moment of her day in rapid detail, while Caleb listened with quiet patience, occasionally glancing at Eliza with a look she couldn't quite name. After supper, Eliza helped Sadie with her reading lessons, her voice steady and calm as the child stumbled over her letters. When Sadie finally nodded off, head resting on the table, Caleb gently lifted her into his arms and carried her upstairs. Eliza lingered by the fire, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. The house was quiet now, save for the faint creak of Caleb's boots overhead as he tucked his daughter into bed. She stared into the flames, feeling a warmth she hadn't known in years, a fragile but undeniable sense of belonging. When Caleb came back down, he paused in the doorway. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, unreadable but not cold, before he murmured, "Long day. Best get some rest. Tomorrow will be just as busy." And as she climbed the stairs, Eliza found herself smiling, just a little, at the thought of another day here, another day where, for the first time in a long time, she could breathe. For a week, Eliza almost convinced herself she belonged. The days fell into a gentle rhythm. Early mornings collecting eggs with Sadie, quiet afternoons mending shirts or tending the small garden, evenings filled with the simple comfort of shared meals. Caleb didn't ask questions about her past, and she didn't volunteer any answers. There was safety in that silence, a fragile bubble where she could pretend the world beyond the ranch didn't exist. But shadows have a way of finding cracks. It started with a stranger in town. Eliza had gone into the general store with Sadie. A small basket clutched in her hands when she felt it, that sharp prickle along her spine, the one that told her she was being watched. She turned, heart pounding, and found a man leaning against a post near the hitching rail, his hat tipped low, but his gaze sharp and hungry. Her breath caught. She knew that look. He didn't approach, didn't speak, but the weight of his stare followed her until she ducked into the safety of the store. She forced herself to smile for Sadie's sake as they selected sugar and flour, but her hands trembled so badly that she nearly dropped the basket. That night, she didn't sleep. Every creak of the house made her flinch, every gust of wind against. The shudders had her clutching the quilt tight around her shoulders. By morning, the ache of fear had settled deep in her bones. She kept to the yard, avoiding the road, her gaze darting to every distant figure on horseback. Caleb noticed. Of course he did. But he said nothing, only watched her with those quiet, steady eyes that seemed to see far more than she wished. On the third day, the stranger came closer. Caleb had gone to the south pasture, and Eliza was hanging. Laundry in the yard when she heard the crunch of hooves on gravel. She froze, her hands tightening around a damp sheet as the man from town tipped his hat from the road. "Afternoon, miss," he drawled, his smile sharp. "Didn't expect to see you all the way out here." Eliza's throat closed. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Before the man could take another step, a shadow fell across the porch. Caleb stood there, broad and still as stone, his eyes cold as a winter sky. "Best keep riding," Caleb said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. The man's smile faltered just for a moment, before he tipped his hat again and wheeled his horse, kicking up dust as he rode away. Eliza's hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the basket of clothespins. Caleb crossed the yard in 2 long strides, stopping a careful distance away, his voice low and steady. "You know him?" Her lips parted, but no sound came, because how could she explain that the life she'd run from, the life she'd thought she'd escaped, had just found her again? Caleb didn't push. Not at first, After the stranger rode off, Eliza busied herself with meaningless tasks, her hands shaking so hard that she nearly dropped the clothespins twice. Caleb watched her from the porch, his jaw tight, his eyes dark, with something sharp and unreadable. He didn't approach, didn't demand answers. But that night, after Sadie had been tucked safely into bed, he found her in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea gone cold. "You gonna tell me?" he asked quietly. "Who that man was?" Eliza stiffened, her gaze fixed on the mug in her hands. For a moment, she thought about lying, brushing it off, insisting she didn't know him. But Caleb's voice, low, steady, patient, left no room for deception. Her breath shuddered as the words began to spill, halting and raw. She told him about the man she had once trusted, the man who had promised marriage and safety but delivered only cruelty and control. She spoke of the nights spent cowering in fear, the bruises hidden beneath high collars and long sleeves, the whispered threats that grew louder with every day she stayed. She told him about the night she ran, clutching a small carpet bag, and little else, boarding the first train that would carry her far from the life that had nearly broken her. When the story was done, silence filled the room, thick, heavy, almost suffocating. Caleb didn't speak right away. He stood by the counter, his hat in his hands, his knuckles white against the brim. Then slowly, he crossed the room and set the hat down. "You ain't gotta be afraid here," he said finally, his voice quiet but sure. "Ain't no man coming onto my land to hurt you, not while I'm standing." Eliza's throat tightened, tears blurring her vision. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He doesn't give up. He'll keep looking. He'll—" Her voice cracked, and she shook her head. "I don't want to bring trouble to your home." Caleb's gaze softened then, though the steel in his eyes didn't fade. "This is my home," he said. "My land, and no one puts fear in the folks under my roof. You hear me?" The words settled over her like a balm, steady and sure. She nodded, though her hands still trembled around the mug. "You don't owe me details," Caleb continued. "But you do need to know this. You and Sadie, you're safe here, long as you want to be." Something in Eliza's chest loosened at that, something that had been wound tight for far too long. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. And as Caleb stepped back, giving her space but leaving his promise hanging in the air like a shield, she felt a fragile but undeniable sense of safety take root. 2 days passed in uneasy quiet. Eliza tried to carry on as though nothing had changed, feeding the chickens with Sadie in the mornings, kneading bread dough in the afternoons. But the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. She could feel Caleb's watchful presence everywhere, steady and silent, like a shield she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Caleb, for his part, said little, but she noticed things. How his rifle, usually stored by the back door, now leaned against the porch rail within easy reach. How he rode the fence lines earlier and later than usual, scanning the horizon as though expecting trouble. How his jaw clenched when he thought she wasn't looking. The morning it happened, the air was heavy with the promise of rain. Eliza was hanging laundry when the distant sound of hooves thundered across the valley. She froze, heart hammering, her eyes darting to the road. It was him. The man from town, his grin sharp and mocking, a predator scenting fear. He reined in at the edge of the yard, tilting his hat with a mock politeness that made bile rise in her throat. "Afternoon, sweetheart," he drawled. "Miss me?" Eliza stumbled back, the basket of linens slipping from her hands. The screen door banged open. Caleb stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, his expression calm but his eyes blazing with something fierce and unyielding. "You got no business here," he said, his voice low and steady. "Turn that horse around and ride out. Now!" The man laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "Didn't realize you'd taken in strays, Turner. Ain't like you to keep damaged goods around." Eliza flinched as though struck, shame and fear twisting in her gut. But Caleb didn't so much as blink. "She ain't yours," he said, the quiet steel in his tone more dangerous than a shout. "And she won't ever be again. You ride out, now, or you'll wish you had." The man's grin faltered, just slightly, at the cold certainty in Caleb's gaze. He spat into the dirt, muttered something under his breath, and wheeled his horse, kicking up dust as he thundered away. Eliza stood frozen, her breath shallow, the world spinning around her. Caleb lowered the rifle but didn't put it down. He turned toward her then, his expression softer, though his jaw was still tight. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her voice wouldn't work. "Good," he said, "because he won't bother you again. Not here." Something inside her cracked then, not from fear this time, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that someone had finally stood for her. Truly stood for her. And for the first time in years, Eliza felt the faintest spark of something she hadn't dared to hope for. Safety. Maybe even trust. The ranch settled into a quiet rhythm after the confrontation. But something had shifted. Caleb didn't speak of that day, didn't mention the man's threats or the way his voice had turned to steel when he'd told him to leave. But Eliza felt the change in the smallest things. How he lingered near the porch when she and Sadie were in the yard. How his gaze softened when it met hers, no longer just watchful but warm, protective in a way that didn't feel smothering, only safe. For the first time in years, she stopped looking over her shoulder. One evening, with the sun sinking low and painting the fields gold, Caleb found her in the garden. She was kneeling among the rows of beans, her skirt hemmed dusty, a smudge of dirt streaked across her cheek. Sadie had run off to chase the barn cat, her laughter echoing faintly from the yard. "You've got a knack for this," Caleb said, his voice quiet, almost teasing. Eliza looked up, startled, then smiled, a small, shy curve of her lips. "I suppose hard work doesn't scare me," she said softly. Caleb crouched beside her, resting his forearms on his knees. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The evening breeze stirred the loose strands of hair at her temples, and she felt his steady presence beside her like a promise. "You don't have to keep running anymore," he said finally, his voice low and sure. "Not from him, not from what happened." Her hands stilled in the soil. "I don't know how," she whispered. "Then let me show you," he said simply. It wasn't a grand declaration, not the sweeping poetry of the novels Eliza had read as a girl, but the quiet sincerity in his words stole her breath all the same. That night, after Sadie had been tucked in, Eliza lingered by the porch steps. Caleb joined her, leaning against the rail, the stars sprawling endlessly overhead. They didn't speak much. There was no need. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was something else entirely. When he finally turned to her, his expression was gentle, careful, as though giving her room to step away if she wished, but she didn't. For the first time, Eliza allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by fear, a future where safety and warmth weren't fleeting dreams but everyday truths. And when his hand brushed hers, tentative but steady, she didn't pull away. Instead, She let herself believe, just for a moment, that healing didn't have to be something she faced alone. Spring came early that year, draping the Turner Ranch in soft greens and wildflowers. The air was warmer now, the sharp bite of winter replaced by a sweet breeze that carried the scent of budding roses from the garden Eliza had tended. With quiet pride, life had fallen into a rhythm that felt, at last, like home. Each morning, Eliza woke to the sound of Sadie's cheerful chatter drifting up the stairs. She'd help with breakfast, hum softly as she gathered eggs, and spend afternoons tending the small vegetable patch or patching clothes by the fire. Caleb worked long days, but there was always a moment, always, that he'd find her, offering a quiet smile or a steady hand that reminded her she was no longer facing the world alone. Still, some nights the old fears tried to creep in, whispering that this happiness was borrowed, that safety couldn't last. On those nights, Caleb never pressed her for words. He'd simply sit beside her on the porch, the quiet weight of his presence grounding her until the whispers faded. It was on one of those evenings, the sky awash with gold and the fields humming with crickets, that everything changed. Sadie had gone inside to help set the table, leaving Eliza and Caleb standing side by side at the edge of the porch. Caleb's hands were shoved deep in his pockets, his hat tipped low, but when he looked at her, there was a softness in his gaze that stole her breath. "Eliza," he said, her name slow and careful on his tongue. She turned, heart fluttering. "Yes?" He hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "You've been through more than most," he said finally. "And I know trust don't come easy, but I need you to know. This place, this ranch, it's yours as much as it's mine. You and Sadie, you're my family now if you'll have it." For a long, breathless moment, the world seemed to still. Eliza felt her throat tighten, tears pricking her eyes, but they weren't the hot, painful tears of fear or sorrow. They were lighter, full of something she hadn't dared to hope for, love, deep and steady, as sure as the man standing before her. She stepped closer, her hands trembling but certain as she reached for his. "I want that," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I want to stay. I want you." The smile that curved Caleb's lips was small but full of quiet relief. He squeezed her hands, grounding her in that steady, unwavering strength that had carried her through the hardest days. "Then you're home," he said simply. And for the first time in her life, Eliza believed it. Truly believed it. As the sun dipped low, painting the world in soft shades of amber and rose, Eliza let herself lean into him, her heart no longer broken or afraid, but open and full. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd stepped off that train, lost and trembling. It was better. It was hers.